these proceedings are here to see that justice is done. And justice is, as any reasonable person would tell you, the finding of the truth. Only we have a problem here.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is the I Don't Belong Here show, and I am your host, Samantha Benigno. I am a behavioral scientist, a career psychotherapist, a sixth-year PhD candidate in clinical psychology, a master's level psychologist and counselor. And today, we are talking about Nicholas Reiner. This case is fascinating from a mental health perspective. And that's because it does appear as though the family is supportive of Nick getting mental health treatment instead of being criminally punished, like being in prison for the rest of his life. And the problem here, from a mental health perspective, is that with this type of history of substance use and abuse, it is going to be one hell of a task for Alan Jackson to try to prove that this was insanity. And I'm going to explain to you exactly why that would be, hopefully, now. Now, you might notice I am in a completely different environment than per usual, and that's because I am out in California for a school event because I am back in school. Last semester, as many of you know, I took the semester off. I was on a leave of absence, and now I am back, and still a lot is left up in the air. I'm not sure what I'm going to be doing this semester because honestly, there's only a couple of things left. And one of them is the biggie, my dissertation. And as I've shared already, I'm a little bit in limbo with the direction I want to go in there. So hopefully I can figure that all out very soon. But in the meantime, here we are. And apparently there is some type of a protective order in place that is barring us from being able to determine precisely what happened to Rob and Michelle Reiner. And apparently that is incredibly rare in these types of cases.
It's a security hold, I think you called it? Or
yeah, they're calling it a security hold on the death records.
I've never heard of that. I mean, I've had lots and lots of murder cases and some high profile cases. Usually things can be, a defense lawyer can receive discovery under what's called a protective order, meaning that evidence is turned over to me and then I cannot release it to anyone outside of my defense team, right? Detective, investigator, paralegals, or so forth. But this particular term I haven't heard.
Do you think the defense has been able to get the reports yet?
On a normal case, it can take a couple of months to get what's called the murder book, which is the entire investigative reports from the police involving the autopsy reports and things. But that's a normal case. This is not a normal case. And then you have the slowdown of the holidays because it doesn't matter how important or how big a case is. You can't make people work during the holidays, right? Especially public servants. And so he might have the information, he might not, but it would not be abnormal for 3 weeks after the alleged murder for the autopsy report to not have been turned over.
Now, does this mean that we're going to see a lot of firsts because we have somebody like Alan Jackson working on behalf of the defendant in this case, Nicholas Reiner, because of the wealth of this family and because of the prestige of this family? Does that mean that we're going to see a lot of unusual delays maybe, or unusual circumstances that we simply just wouldn't normally see because this type of information is of public interest, and particularly because of how beloved Rob Reiner is to all of us, right? I mean, these are Hollywood sweethearts, and there's a lot of public interest in this case as a result. However, you also have, at least from what everyone has been arguing and able to extrapolate to this point, the family supporting Nick Reiner in that they don't want to see him wind up in prison, but rather get the mental health treatment that he needs.
Why would they want to keep the autopsy report secret, though, from the public? I mean, in my opinion, the public has a right to that kind of information. The medical examiner has a role of making that information public, how people die. They've already got someone in custody. They've said that they were stabbed. Why wouldn't they give out all the information? Like, is there some investigative reason, do you think?
So the only thing I can think of is that given at the level of the people that we're talking about, that their requests were made in order to try to keep this at bay for as long as possible, for the privacy of the family during a very difficult time during the holidays, and that they just did not want this out there right away.
And a huge thank you to Brian Entin and the defense attorney, Ambrosio Rodriguez, that he brought on to help us try to understand what's happening here. Keep in mind, we don't have really any of the facts when it comes to this case yet. There's a lot of wild speculation, stories that are out there about the mental health of Nicholas Reiner in the days, weeks, and months before this incident. We don't know what the defense strategy is going to be yet, but there's a lot of speculation that it is going to involve some type of insanity defense.
News coming out through TMZ about schizophrenia being part of it. Is this where you think Alan Jackson is going to go in the defense of Nick Reiner? Get into the mental state, the mental history, and more of the why this happened as opposed to who did it?
Right. Well, Vinny, I read that article and came to the same conclusion that it sounds as though you did. Schizophrenia is a devastating mental illness. It sounds like he's had it for quite a while. It sounds like his medication was recently changed. And it sounds like the medication, along with his mental illness, may have made him dangerous. So, I wouldn't be surprised at all if, that is part of the complexity of the case that Alan mentioned after the arraignment.
This is a devastating tragedy that has befallen the Reiner family. We all recognize that. Our hearts go out to the entire Reiner family. There are very, very complex and serious issues that are associated with this case. These need to be thoroughly but very carefully dealt with and examined and looked at and analyzed. We ask that during this process you allow the system to move forward in the way that it was designed to move forward, not with a rush to judgment, not with jumping to conclusions, but with restraint and with dignity and with the respect that this system and this process deserves and that the family deserves.
And in California, that limits what's possible to really only a handful of strategies. One, there is this competency piece, and that could mean ultimately delaying the trial, delaying the procedures quite a ways in some cases. And competency is quite different from the insanity plea, right? Competency means, am I able to assist in my own defense? Can I understand what the judge is saying? Can I understand what my attorneys are advising? Can I participate with my attorneys in my own defense? That is a right that we all have, to be of sound mind in our own defense. Now, it is not, I guess, unusual for people to have to be properly medicated or sent to a psychiatric hospital in order to become stabilized, in order to then eventually sit for trial. Whether or not that will happen in this case, we have no idea. But that is one thing that could happen. The defense could try to say that he's not competent as of now to sit and serve in his own defense. And in that case, in the state of California, there are a few options. The prosecutor's office and the defense team can come together and decide on who's going to do that evaluation, or they can each have their own evaluation done. And if those two assessments are very different, then the judge ultimately brings in, I guess, a third evaluator, and they make the determination about what will happen, whether that person is indeed competent or not. And if they aren't competent, then they have to go to a psychiatric hospital, again, to be properly medicated. Now, in the real world, that process does not take more than a few weeks. You're lucky if you can get a patient into a psychiatric hospital to be properly remedicated or medicated for that long. That would be a miracle, really. And that's even in the worst case. We're talking about psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar with psychosis, right? Real mental illness. But apparently there have been cases where, let's say, people fought medication. They didn't want to have to be medicated. And so that then, delays the whole thing even longer. And delays can happen once competency is sought, right? So that's one possible route. Now, there are very rare instances where I guess people have spent 10 years in a psychiatric hospital, awaiting trial as they try to become competent to serve in their own defense. I cannot imagine that would happen here, but I guess with Alan Jackson as your defense attorney, anything is possible. Now, once you are deemed to be competent to help in your defense, then there's the whole insanity plea. And in California, apparently, this is two separate trials. First, there would be a trial to determine whether he was indeed the person responsible for the crime. So whether or not Nick Reiner killed his parents, Rob and Michelle. And then there would be the insanity portion, or a separate trial, I guess, technically, that would determine whether he was truly insane at the time of the crime. And that, of course, would be heavily influenced by experts and who has the better experts that are more convincing. And here is where I cannot imagine how Alan Jackson is going to get around the substance abuse. And I'm going to try to explain exactly what I mean.
Let me ask you, Philip Toubé, what is this trial going to be about?
Oh, I think health and wellness is going to be on trial here, Vinny. There is a tremendous intersection here between what I call the polysubstance abuse patient, or in this case, criminal defendant, the mentally ill defendant, the defendant who might be on the spectrum, the defendant who might have a personality disorder, and somebody who has gone untreated or perhaps has had adverse interaction of the drugs. And I think what has happened, not just to Nick, but to many people living with these co-occurring disorders, is that unless and until you have treatment providers who work as a team cohesively, almost like a mini village of providers, and you only treat one of those co-occurring disorders in isolation, you're never going to get better. What's going to happen is you're only going to treat one of the ailments and you'll be spiraling as to the other ones. So what you need health and wellness professionals who can work together to make sure that the medication doses are proper, or that they're even indicated, that there is even a proper diagnosis of any mental disorder or mental defect, and that certainly that any addiction from polysubstance abuse is being addressed.
This gentleman is absolutely correct. And what he is saying here is so important to understand, particularly for the defense team here in coming up with their defense strategy. Because while this may go without saying, in my mind, it is important to say out loud what this doctor is implying, which is you cannot possibly treat any severe underlying mental health condition if there is active drug use, active pervasive drug use, active polysubstance, multiple drugs and or alcohol use at one time. It is just not possible. In fact, you can't even really know what the mental health picture is unless or until that substance use disorder is treated effectively. So if there was polysubstance abuse, just like this doctor is saying, if there was serious substance abuse, and if everything that we know about, number one, Nicholas Reiner's history.
You went to, how many times did you go to rehab? You said, is it 18 times?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
But it had to come from you. So what was rock bottom?
There wasn't one. It's all rock bottom. It all sucked.
When did you, what made you finally make it not a 19th?
I got just sick of it. I mean, it's hard to believe that you wouldn't get sick after 5 of them, but I mean, after 18, I was like, okay, I'm pretty bored of this. It wasn't like I want to go back to rehab. I was like, I'm sick of this cycle, this using drugs, it being so temporary, the fix, then going back into a place for months on end, then getting out and just, you know, rinse, wash, repeat.
This being my life.
Yeah.
Do you believe, and they'll tell you, you're gonna die if you continue on this way? Do you think you would die, or did you still feel invincible?
No, I mean, of course there's that level of feeling that way, but I was, you know, the rate I was going was probably not great. Gonna end up great.
Did you feel like, did you ever get close?
Yeah. Sure.
How do you manage it now? Do you go to AA meetings regularly? And
I found that those weren't as helpful for me as things like staying active and, like, you know, replacing, like, not just, replacing the activity that you were doing before with stuff that's healthier, like working out, if you can afford it, going to a therapist, as well as, like, you know, having a good, you know, support group of friends. I have that, which is lucky, and not everybody has that. And I have supportive parents. I can't tell exactly what got me into them besides the fact that I thought they were really cool and I just wanted to do them. But I think I heard this question a lot, and I think the only answer I can give for wanting to tell a story like this is that it's even more powerful to tell it about someone who is going through this and they're given everything and they're in an opulent situation.
It was never about the drugs. All I ever wanted was a way to kill the noise.
Getting sober is a selfish thing. You gotta help yourself first.
For everyone, it's different. For me, the noise was basically, you know, living in the family that I live in and catching heat for that sort of stuff. And also just—
For being a Reiner?
I guess. I mean, people would like to think that's a real bigger deal than it actually is, but it's really like I was an emotional kid who had problems, and I just was not so fond of myself, so I kind of, you know, had problems in that way. But in terms of the thing you were saying before, it's like I think that our relationship was not as it was portrayed in the film. Like, there were this sort of like holding the line and being tough, but like we didn't ever argue like quite like that. I mean, we did, I guess, to a degree, but it was never.
He was fiery. You don't seem very fiery to me. You seem like you might just—
I get crazy.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
And he, by his own admission, is notorious for using methamphetamine and heroin. If this man has been using those drugs in any time just surrounding this crime, I cannot imagine how it is possible to get around that. Because think about it, okay? What that would open the door to is anyone who's ever committed a crime under the influence of alcohol and or drugs to now use the insanity plea to get off. Well, I was high. I was out of my mind on drugs. And you can argue, and I'm sure Alan Jackson will do his very best to try, you can argue that there was an underlying mental health problem and that may have, escalated the drug use. But you cannot say what would have happened had there not been drug use, because there's no way to know that. Because the fact is, this man has been on and off very serious, the most serious mood-altering chemicals on the planet for a very long time. And the problem with that is pretty simple to understand. If I am taking these mood-altering chemicals into my body and into my brain, even marijuana and alcohol, which are two commonly abused substances, maybe things that most people don't really perceive as dangerous, are very powerful from a neurological perspective. I mean, these are drugs that completely change in a very significant way your physiology. Okay, they completely change your body's chemistry. There is no way around the fact that I am manually altering my brain's chemistry. I am having a direct impact on changing the chemistry in my brain, in my body. So I am not going to be the same person as I would have been had I never taken drugs. There's going to be very serious ramifications on my mental health, on my brain health. He is 32 years old, Nick Reiner, and started using substances to the point of needing to be in rehab by the time he was at 15, right? And now we're talking about someone who is likely polysubstance dependent, meaning he's used lots of different drugs and all at the same time. And that's, again, from Nick Reiner's own admission. According to him, not only did he drink and smoke weed regularly with his friends, but he wound up using methamphetamine and heroin as a self-identified as his drugs of choice. So what that means is you are completely manually influencing your brain chemistry to the point where you are creating what can best be described as chaos and total instability. Now, for those that have schizophrenia, most of the time with males, the onset of schizophrenia is going to be late teenage, even maybe early 20s, right? So college, that's typically the time where you're going to see it. Now, it can happen earlier, and it does, of course, can happen later, but most of the time you're going to see during these times of both big hormone change and big life change. So what happens around 18 years old? We are supposed to leave home, right? Whether we're going to go get a job or whether we're going to go away to college, we leave the nest. And so any kind of big significant change could be a facilitator because, again, we are talking about the brain and brain chemistry. And what is also very common is for, let's say you are working with somebody who goes away to college and they start abusing marijuana, or they start abusing substances at college, maybe the way thousands of young people will normally do. But in this case, because there is this predisposition for a mental illness like schizophrenia, what'll happen is it'll trigger that schizophrenia, right? Either because there's been tremendous stress, right? The anxiety, the uncertainty, just the fear of, being on your own in a new place, away from home, away from everybody you've known, your family, your friends, whatever. And or Now you've added substances of abuse, which again are powerful. These are the trump cards of mood altering experiences. They are powerful, powerful. They completely change your active brain chemistry. So you are not really the you that you would be if you had never done that, right? Now, maybe you've all either had an experience or known someone who, under the influence, let's say, of alcohol as a teenager or young adult, gets drunk and does something they would never do sober. Well, now imagine that you're always under the influence and the substances that you're taking are, numerous. And at a certain point, if you're smoking marijuana to get out of bed, you're drinking every night, right? You don't think anything of it, by the way. For people that are active substance abusers, alcohol every day, either in excess or not, is a normal part of life, particularly if you're somebody who's using central nervous system stimulants like cocaine or amphetamines, because you naturally are trying to also take the edge off, right? Because those are drugs that, yes, they release large amounts of dopamine, but dopamine, the central nervous system is sped up to the point where it's not actual pleasure per se, because what dopamine really is a motivation neurotransmitter. So these are drugs like cocaine where you take a lot of it, you don't really feel good per se. You feel stimulated, incredibly stimulated, and that causes a desire to want to do stuff, right? It's what it's causing in you. And one of the things that you want to do is more of the drug, right? Because you're exhausting your body's dopamine supply. You're blocking the recycling of that very important neurotransmitter to mental health. Okay. So when you are abusing substances routinely, the way somebody like Nick Reiner was, it gets to the point where if you've been doing that on and off for many years, by the time you're 30 years old, if you make it to 30 years old and you continue to do that, your brain is really destabilized. Your brain is very unstable. Your brain and your body is always looking for consistency. It's always looking for continuity. Continuity is like rule number one in adaptation or in our survival ability. And that's because efficiency is the name of the game. It's the name of the game with health on any level. That's why those who are really trying to get out in front of age, those who are extreme health nuts, will have a tremendous amount of continuity in their day. They will wake up at the same time. They will go to work at the same time. They will go to the gym at the same time. They will eat foods that are very consistent at the same times. They become like a machine of predictability for the body. And that is sort of like the secret, if you will, to not only physical health, but also mental health, because your body and brain does not have to use any of its resources to try to guess what's coming next. It knows, right? And that's because you've trained that. Now, imagine what it looks like if your situation is the exact opposite, where each day your brain and body has virtually no idea what's coming next, because you have become so inconsistent, with the only consistencies being substance abuse. But if it's polysubstance abuse, which means multiple substances across a long period of time, then there's tremendous inconsistency. So the only thing that is consistent is inconsistency, or what you might know or call chaos. And once chaos becomes the norm, well, of course, it's going to look on paper a whole lot like schizophrenia, which ultimately is a very similar physiological experience, but with a very different cause, right? Not because you're using substances, but because in all likelihood of some type of activating stressor and a series of biological predispositions for that effect at the physiological level, right? Now, of course, we still don't know exactly why some people wind up with schizophrenia, other people don't, but we have been able to locate multiple genetic markers for folks who do have it. Either they have it in their family or they have it themselves, right? So we know that there are genetic markers for things like schizophrenia. The problem is, even if you can prove that there were signs and symptoms of schizophrenia, and maybe even for a while in the years that led up to this, if he has been using and abusing multiple substances to the degree that he himself admitted to doing before he made that movie with his father being Charlie, if that's any indication of what things were like when he did finally go back to using and abusing substances, we already know, based on what it means to be dependent on substances, what the problem is. We already know that the chaos that we might see with schizophrenia without drugs of abuse is being caused by the drugs of abuse. And you cannot say definitively, well, it would have happened anyway if he hadn't used substances. That is not how this works. But the truth is, there is no way to discern whether or not Nick Reiner has schizophrenia versus substance-induced psychosis unless or until there were no substances in the mix at all for a very prolonged period of time, right? At least 6 months. I would argue it would have to be much longer, but I'm sure you could make the argument that 6 months would be enough. Very few people with the kind of substance use history that Nick Reiner has is going to just stop using for 6 months without medication so that they can determine what their underlying psychiatric picture now looks like. So the point is that from a mental health perspective, to try to make the case that, well, Nick Reiner's really had schizophrenia all along, but wound up using and abusing an unimaginable amount of substances of all kinds that ultimately led to a chaotic physiology that would be the same as somebody with schizophrenia, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. There would have to have been no substances in the mix for a prolonged period of time for any competent mental health professional to be able to say, oh no, this is legitimate schizophrenia. And that's what happened on the night that Rob and Michelle were killed. However, one of the most predictable, maybe in my mind, the most predictable mental health condition there is substance use disorders. And that's because we can see exactly what happens to a brain and body when it continues to be living on a diet of substances of abuse. And those changes internally are very consistent across people. Okay? And as I said, what is happening if you are a polysubstance dependent person and for the better part of 2 or 3 decades have been taking very powerful mood altering substances almost daily or all the time, you're going to create total chaos internally. And might that result in what appears to look a whole lot like schizophrenia on paper? Absolutely. That is called substance-induced psychosis. And that's a real problem for Alan Jackson, in my estimation. Now, what do I know? Right? Maybe the laws in California, there's loopholes somewhere. Maybe They're going to try to prove that he wasn't actively using substances in the days, weeks, months before this incident. What I can tell you is if he was, and there is evidence of that, I just don't see how you're going to get around that as the cause ultimately of the level of dysfunction or dysregulation that's happening in the mind of Nicholas Reiner. So it should be very interesting, and certainly I will be watching.
It is the defense counselor's duty to protect the rights of the individual, as it is the prosecution's duty to uphold and defend the laws of the state. Justice for all. Only we have a problem here.
I live inside my own world of make-believe. Kids screaming in their cradles, profanities. I see the world through ice covered in ink and bleach. Cross out the ones who heard my cries and watched me weep. I love everything. Fire spreading all around my room. My world's so bright, it's hard to breathe, but that's alright. Hush.